Hello, everyone. Welcome back to St. Louis Teens. We are honored to have with us today Marianne Bates, who is the Executive Director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL, for North America at MIT. JPAL seeks to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. Director Bates, at JPAL, you leverage research by affiliated professors from universities across the continent and policy experts to generate and disseminate evidence about which anti-poverty social policies work and why. Director Bates, thank you so much for your phenomenal service and for being here with us today.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Director Bates, can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to work with research, policy, and solutions to end poverty, and how has your journey been like so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've always been interested particularly in helping people overcome barriers of access to education and access to healthcare. And I think this was mainly informed by two things. The first is that my parents are originally from the Amish community in Ohio, and this is a community that has many strengths. One aspect of it, though, is that they limit education to 8th grades. And so a lot of my initial perspectives in pursuing an education and developing my professional career was really informed by the firsthand experience of the importance of really opening educational opportunities for everyone and the consequences when one does not. So I think that was kind of my initial interest, especially in education, and kind of thinking about how policies and programs can really reach people who are facing barriers. I think the second formative experience was volunteer work that I did, including internationally, where I was working with organizations and with people and myself, incredibly well-intentioned, but also wondering what is the real impact of what we're doing, right? There's a little bit of distance sometimes between the updates that get sent home and what you realize on the ground in terms of, what are we really making a difference? Are we really addressing the root causes of, inequality or poverty? So that's really what propelled me to work in public policy and research, and part of why I'm so passionate about the work we do at JPAL, which is not just about aiming to, start new and innovative approaches, but really rigorously test, is what we're hoping truly making a difference? Is it really working well, and for whom? So that's how I came to this work.
And JPAL does so much incredible work, and we're so thankful for the work that JPAL is able to do. So I know it can be difficult, but if you had to sort of share one of your most favorite parts of your work at JPAL, what would that be?
Yeah, that is hard to pick. One of the things that I find most energizing, that I think is really crucial to this work, is partnering with government leaders, partnering with social sector leaders, and really having these foundational partnerships from kind of step zero of starting with their questions. What is the priority question of the local elected leader? What's the priority question of the person who founded this nonprofit? What unanswered questions can we really work with them to solve? And then, creatively working together to design nimble and rigorous evaluations to address those questions. So as just one example of many, I'm personally involved in an evaluation that we're currently doing in South Carolina, where the state of South Carolina, their Department of Health and Human Services, came to us and said, we're working with this amazing nonprofit, the Nurse Family Partnership, to scale up home visiting services for low-income mothers, for mothers in the state, and wanted to have JPAL work with them to assess the impact of the program. And so we've been able to work very closely with South Carolina over the last few years to develop an evaluation that's testing, how does this program work for the moms? How does it work for their babies when they're born, as they grow? And really using the incredibly rich administrative data that the state of South Carolina has to do an evaluation that's really going to be useful not only in South Carolina, but far beyond as well.
And you talk about some of the work that JPAL has been able to do, and JPAL has been instrumental in creating and evaluating several programs and policies to combat poverty in our country and across the world. In your opinion, what are some of the success stories of JPAL in terms of policies that we have successfully passed to end poverty, and some of the great milestones that we have achieved in terms of reducing poverty?
That's a great question. I think one of the lesser known stories of the last 10, 20 years is just how much global poverty has been reduced overall. I think it's a success story that we often don't celebrate nearly enough. I think the other thing I'll highlight is even just JPAL, and we're a network of professors around the world who've done, over 1,000 randomized controlled trials or randomized evaluations. And even just, and that's a small subset, of course, of, the amount of research that's been done. And even just within that subset, we know of policies that have touched over 400 million lives around the world, of cases where, one of our affiliated professors tested an approach, was found to be effective, and we can then, see an example where that approach was scaled up to reach millions of people. And that's across, school-based health interventions, summer jobs programs here in the US. I think the one, you asked for just one, so I'm going to try to answer that question. The one that I think is really inspiring and that cuts across our work from India to Zambia to here in the US and in Chicago is what we call teaching at the right level. And this is an approach that helps kids who've fallen years behind, in some cases, the curriculum in school, catch up. And sometimes I've heard kind of pessimistic conversations in education policy circles that, once kids reach middle school or once they reach high school, it's just too late if they've fallen so far behind. And in fact, we've seen that programs like, Saga Education here in the US, programs like Pratham in India, have been found again and again to be extremely effective at helping kids who've fallen years behind catch up with these targeted tutoring programs. So we call it teaching at the right level. There are these targeted tutoring programs that meet kids where they are today and help them build foundational skills that help them grow, as opposed to being restricted to just teaching, the grade level curriculum where they might be sitting now, but, aren't at that level yet. So we've seen this approach be enormously effective, and I'm really inspired by the government and foundation partners who've worked to scale this, provide the resources so that some really amazing partners can bring this to scale.
And Director Bates, with your experience in suggesting and evaluating policy, do you see a significant gap between scientific evidence and then translating it into policy that directly influences lives? And if so, what are common hurdles to creating such policies and how can we overcome them?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I think one important hurdle is the demand for scientific evidence. Are we as citizens demanding it? Are, our leaders demanding scientific evidence? How are we, as a community, as a society, really looking at data, evidence, and the scientific method as something that can measurably and usefully be used to improve lives? So I think kind of one important part of this is looking at ways to really improve trust in science and improving the demand for science, right? And that's something we can all do, something that you're doing right now with these kinds of interviews, and I think it's really important for us to think about how we can all collectively work toward that. I think a second potential barrier that I've seen in talking with decision makers is that even those who do want to follow science, who do want to implement the most evidence-based policies, find it very difficult to sort of sift through the mountains of evidence, the mountains of scientific studies that are put out there, and really, find the needle in the haystack, if you will, of, what's salient, what's relevant for them for their specific question. So I think that sifting problem and figuring out, this, it's such a large question, how do I figure out what evidence is relevant, is also really challenging. And it's part of why we at JPAL developed a specific, what we call the policy group. So we've been able to raise resources to have professional staff who focus in different areas, who can then spend time with decision makers saying, okay, your goal is to help kids who've fallen behind, especially with the current challenges with COVID. Kids are not attending school in person in many places. How will we help kids who've fallen behind? Okay, that's the question you're trying to address. Let me help you sort through the evidence. And we've also seen a lot of demand for cases where we've put out kind of reviews of the big picture. So not just, you can get on our website and go through our database and look at 1,000 literally, different evaluations. Few people have time for that. And so when we've been able to put out reviews that have the big picture, it's been really useful. So for example, one of my colleagues, Vincent Kwan and Phil Ariopoulos, who are part of the JPL network, put out a review on education technology that looked at over 100 different experiments, looking at the impact of different education interventions that all use technology as part of it. And from that, then synthesized this big picture that said, okay, these kinds of interventions tend to work best. These kinds of approaches don't tend to have an impact, even though money's directed at them. And so here's the big picture. And that got a lot of interest. We had individual school teachers responding to that and saying, here's how I'm going to use that in my classroom. We've had people in government leadership positions, people in philanthropy, people in the press, all responding to that synthesis. So I think, like in some, we need to work on ensuring that people are truly demanding evidence and demanding that their leaders look to evidence and science. And then we need to make it easier for decision makers to find the most salient and relevant evidence for their question and challenge.
And you talked about this a little bit with the COVID-19 pandemic, how JPAL has started to ask questions there and the impact that JPAL has been able to have in terms of alleviating some of the issues that the pandemic has created. And with the onset of the pandemic now, professors and members with JPAL have initiated new research and advised governments on actions and policy to combat the pandemic and its effects. What are the keys to your success in navigating solutions during these unprecedented times?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. We were very fortunate in being able to pivot a bit when the pandemic started and actually launched a new initiative, the COVID Recovery and Resilience Initiative, that's providing some pilot grants and seed money to our partners, state and local governments, and the researchers we partner with, to be able to come together and kind of quickly say, what are the most important questions that we can answer that can help inform really crisis response, especially for state and local governments. So a couple of lessons learned from this. One is the value of having existing data systems that you can then repurpose and use. So in already having what we call administrative data. So data that a city or a state might already be collecting, data from their hospitals, right? Data from their employment records that can then let us kind of very quickly in moments of crisis pinpoint, okay, here's where the need is greatest. Here's where we really need to intervene. So I think already built existing data infrastructure has been really, really important during this time. And then the second point echoes the answer I had for one of your earlier questions, which is the importance of really starting with the local priority questions, right? And that's going to vary from place to place. So for instance, we were working with one state recently where they actually had an excess of COVID tests, but we're very concerned about the fact that take-up of COVID testing seemed to be particularly low in some communities. And so they wanted to work with us and work with researchers who have deep experience looking at questions of healthcare access, especially by race, to understand how to better reach out to Black communities, how to better reach out to Native American communities, how to better reach out to the Hispanic communities in their area and say, here's how we can make testing more equitable and accessible for everyone. And so that's a great example of using, an existing partnership and relationship we'd already been working with them, using data they had already been collecting, using relevant research from pre-COVID times to kind of inform, here's what we could test, here's what we could try out in partnership with your local partners.
And Director Bates, you talked about an important problem in your TEDx talk last year. And despite extensive research, we often lack a methodology to use research done in various parts of the world and adopt it into practice elsewhere or to a different demographic population. And with my social initiative, helping those who are homeless start their own businesses, there is no research in the area except for a similar program called Grameen Bank, which is a microloan program in Bangladesh. Can I use their data and apply it to my own work in St. Louis? And if so, what would be the best approach for me and for others who are looking to adopt foreign research or research done in a different area?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one we actually get a lot, right? So what you're essentially asking is, is there anything useful I can glean from work done, say, in Bangladesh, here in my own city? And the answer, of course, is it depends. But what I've found really exciting is thinking about ways to move from kind of an like, I don't know, those locations seem very dissimilar. How could you possibly, take research from one place and use it somewhere else? And we have actually found that there are sensible ways to approach that question. So here's how I would boil it down into just a few questions. I would start not by saying, are the two locations identical, right? So are St. Louis and Bangladesh identical? Absolutely not, right? St. Louis and Boston aren't identical, right? And the farther you zoom in, you're still going to come to the same conclusion. So, but a lot of times, especially in international development, we tend to use geography as the main lens through which we look at this. Like, well, was it tested nearby, right? Was it in a similar location? So instead, I would take a step back and ask the question, is the problem you're trying to address similar to the problem that was trying to be addressed elsewhere, right? Are you addressing a similar problem? What's the underlying problem that your microloan program or your social enterprise is trying to address? So is the problem the same? And then I think the next step is to think about what high quality evidence might already exist from somewhere else that's relevant to your context. And then there are a whole series of questions you can ask once you've gotten to those first two steps, right? Is the problem the same? Is there any high quality evidence on addressing that problem? And then there are some steps you can go through to think through, like, is this similar enough? What data could I look at to try to answer that question? And we've tried to sort through this in something that we call the generalizability puzzle. And my former colleague Rachel Glenister and I have a piece out on that called the generalizability puzzle, where we provide a framework for people to walk through these questions step by step. And so I think the answer is, what we've seen in different cases is that sometimes the answer is no. What works somewhere else is unlikely to work in this new location. And sometimes the answer is yes. Even across surface level, radically different locations, there is actually a really similar problem and you can translate it. So again, the work we've done on what we call teaching at the right level, same underlying approach worked in Chicago and rural India, right? Very different locations, but similar underlying broad problem and approach was found effective.
And I think that's definitely a great way to sort of think about how you can use and apply research and data that has been used elsewhere and apply it to your own sort of instance, even if those are sort of different. And it is amazing now that even without significant resources, many teens and youth are starting social initiatives and nonprofits. How can these young individuals and their organizations build partnerships with evidence-based organizations such as JPAL to achieve the common mission? And on the other hand, how do you think that more organizations can be interactive with teens in their community and have impactful partnerships?
I'm incredibly inspired by the initiatives that teens are starting today. I think especially with social media and different platforms, the ability to get your message out to a wide range of people and to a broad audience today is unlike what most generations alive today had when they were teens. Certainly true in my case, and makes me feel kind of old to say that. So I think there's tremendous opportunities. And to your first question, how can you partner with evidence organizations like JPAL? I think, again, starting with the question of, what problem are you trying to solve? And then, what data already exists that you can learn from in addressing that. I think that's where organizations like JPAL could potentially be helpful in connecting teens with other organizations that are addressing similar problems, or even just sharing, here's what's been tried in these different locations. And so perhaps you can build on it, right? And innovate and develop something new. And thinking about, what you and your unique perspective can really add that's different from what might already be being tried in various industries. So I think there's really a new and unique perspective that can be added. And then for organizations, I think it's really on us to do more than we have to date in terms of bringing teens to the table and listening to perspectives, right? Especially if we're developing programs and interventions, or working to test them that are aimed at helping kids, helping teens in schools, really partnering with teenagers in that design phase to ensure that we're having a broad range of perspectives there. And then also elevating voices. So, like what we're doing right now, I think is a great example of ways to have teens make their voices heard. I think it's also on us as organizations to bring that in more when we host events, when we're hosting roundtables, ensuring that we're bringing a wider range of people to the table. And just as one recent example, we just launched a new podcast, JPAL Voices, last week, and my colleague Rohit Neampally, who's running that, I was really thrilled that, you know, in the first episode and more to come, some of the young people who are part of these summer jobs programs that he's examining in the podcast are part of the podcast, right? And sharing their stories directly and really being a part of the conversation about, you know, what needs to happen.
And Director Bates, what is your message to teens during these difficult times, and how can we be better prepared and be a part of the social innovation and solutions?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So I think keeping a healthy dose of optimism is really helpful and useful. And what I mean by that is that I think I see a lot of potential for simultaneously working towards big systems level change. And I think a lot of the movements that we've seen in the last few years, a lot of the calls for change are really at a systems level, right? The calls for change on climate change, right? On racial equity, on so many important social issues are really calling for systems level change, and that's important. And I think simultaneously with that and complementary to that is to not overlook the potential for incremental change, right? So while we're all working for and pushing for the systems level change, let's also test things and try things that are working towards incremental improvements as well. Something that, you know, I've been inspired in the work that we're doing. You know, sometimes it sounds like we're working on relatively small issues. Sometimes we're working on larger issues, but when you add it all together, incremental improvements in, you know, helping kids learn in school, helping people have access to good opportunities and careers and entrepreneurship afterwards, you know, helping people have better access to healthcare, all of those things can really come together to have measurable and concrete improvements in people's lives.
Director Bates, we thank you so much for your phenomenal leadership in our efforts to end poverty, and thank you so much for your time today and answering all of our questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity.